Jake Morrison's hands locked on the steering wheel. His night security shift finally over. In the back seat, 5-year-old Mia slept soundly, her pale face peaceful against the worn fabric. That's when he saw her. A young woman in an expensive black dress, standing barefoot on the Brooklyn Bridge railing, arms spread like broken wings against the September dawn. His daughter's medical bracelet caught the morning light as she stirred. The woman on the bridge swayed forward. Jake slammed the brakes. Mia jerked awake, crying out in confusion and fear as her father bolted from the car into the fog-laden morning. His work boots pounded against concrete as the woman's heels slipped on wet metal. "Don't jump!" he shouted, lunging forward as she fell. His calloused hand caught her wrist just as gravity claimed her. The momentum yanked him against the railing, his ribs screaming in protest. Behind him, Mia's terrified sobs pierced the air. The woman dangled above the East River, her designer dress clinging like a shroud. Her green eyes met his, not grateful, but surprised. "I've got nothing left to lose," she whispered through chattering teeth. "But you do." How could saving a stranger's life destroy everything he'd fought to protect? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning mist clung to Brooklyn's gentrified streets as Jake Morrison navigated his way home, the events of 6 months ago still haunting every corner of his transformed life. What had once been a comfortable existence as vice president at Manhattan Trust Bank had crumbled like autumn leaves after Sarah's diagnosis. Cancer had a way of rewriting everything: bank accounts, career trajectories, and the very definition of what mattered. His wife's final words echoed in the cramped studio apartment they now called home. "Promise me you'll never let Mia feel like a burden." Jake had kept that promise through 2 years of single parenthood, even as the medical bills mounted like storm clouds. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd once approved loans for families in crisis, never imagining he'd become one himself. Mia Morrison possessed the kind of resilience that humbled grown men. At 5 years old, she faced her acute lymphoblastic leukemia with the matter-of-fact acceptance that only children could muster. Her artwork covered their apartment walls: crayon drawings of families with 3 people instead of 4, hospital rooms transformed into castles, and endless portraits of Mommy watching from the clouds. The drawings broke Jake's heart and mended it simultaneously. Their routine had become a carefully orchestrated dance around doctor appointments and treatment schedules. Jake worked the night security shift at Mount Sinai Hospital, a cruel twist of fate that kept him employed in the very building where his daughter received treatment. The proximity allowed him to check on her during breaks, though it meant seeing other families navigate the same treacherous waters of pediatric oncology. The Williamsburg studio apartment, with its exposed brick and trendy fixtures, cost more than Jake earned in a month. Gentrification had priced out the working class, yet here they remained, clinging to their lease like survivors on driftwood. The neighborhood's transformation mirrored his own. Once prosperous, now struggling to maintain dignity amid rising costs and diminishing resources. Frank Morrison, Jake's father, visited every Sunday with groceries and war stories. The Vietnam veteran understood sacrifice in ways that transcended generations, his weathered hands often steadying Jake when despair threatened to overwhelm. "Boy, you're fighting a different kind of war," Frank would say, "but you're fighting it with honor." The medical debt had reached $180,000, a number that haunted Jake's dreams. Insurance companies spoke in riddles and fine print, denying coverage for experimental treatments that might save Mia's life. Each rejection letter felt like a personal judgment on his worth as a father, a provider, a man. Yet something had shifted that morning on the bridge. The woman in the expensive dress, Grace, had looked at him with recognition that transcended their brief encounter. In her desperate green eyes, Jake had seen a reflection of his own desperation, though hers was clothed in designer fabric rather than hospital scrubs and work uniforms. As he tucked Mia into their pull-out sofa bed, her small hand found his. "Daddy, why was that pretty lady so sad this morning?" The question lingered in the air like incense, carrying weight that Jake couldn't yet comprehend. The rescue had left Grace Sullivan trembling on the bridge's walkway, her $1,000 dress clinging to her frame like a second skin. Jake Morrison knelt beside his daughter's car seat, checking Mia's pale face for any signs of distress from the sudden stop. The little girl's eyes were wide with confusion, her medical bracelet catching the early morning light as she reached for her father. "It's okay, sweetheart," Jake murmured, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Daddy just had to help someone." Grace watched this intimate moment between father and daughter, something twisting in her chest. She'd been ready to end everything just moments before, but seeing this man risk his own child's safety to save a stranger shifted something fundamental in her understanding of human nature. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "People only care about themselves, Grace. Everything else is just performance." "Thank you," Grace whispered, wrapping her arms around herself as the September morning breeze cut through her wet dress. Her bare feet were scraped from the bridge's rough surface, but the physical pain felt distant compared to the emotional numbness that had driven her here. Jake studied her face, noting the expensive cut of her dress, the professional manicure despite her disheveled state. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his bank training kicking in. He'd always been good at reading people, assessing risk, understanding the story behind the numbers. "I don't know," Grace answered honestly. It was the first honest thing she'd said in months, maybe years. Her engagement ring caught the light, a 5-carat diamond that felt like a shackle around her finger. Derek Whitfield's proposal had been a business transaction disguised as romance, orchestrated by their fathers over scotch and cigars. Mia stirred in her car seat, and Grace noticed the child's pallor, the way her small frame seemed too fragile for the safety harness. Years of secret volunteer work at Mount Sinai had taught her to recognize the signs. "Leukemia?" she asked softly. Jake's defensive walls slammed up immediately. "That's not your concern." "I'm sorry," Grace said quickly. "I volunteer at children's hospitals. I know the look." She gestured vaguely at Mia's medical bracelet, the specialized car seat designed for fragile passengers, the careful way Jake handled his daughter. The admission hung between them like a bridge of its own. Jake's expression softened slightly as he processed this information. Here was this obviously wealthy woman who spent her time with sick children. It didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed about people like her. "Acute lymphoblastic leukemia," he said finally. "Diagnosed 8 months ago." Grace's heart clenched. She knew that diagnosis, knew the treatment protocols, knew the financial devastation it wreaked on families. "I'm Grace," she said, extending a hand that shook slightly from cold and shock. "Jake Morrison." He helped her to her feet, noting how she winced when weight hit her scraped soles. "This is Mia." "Hi, Mia," Grace said gently, crouching down to the little girl's level despite her wet dress. "I like your butterfly clip." Mia smiled shyly, her first genuine expression since waking up scared and confused. "Daddy bought it for me. It matches my hospital gown." The simple statement hit Grace like a physical blow. This child spoke of hospital gowns the way other 5-year-olds talked about school uniforms, with casual familiarity. Grace glanced at Jake and saw the pain he tried to hide, the weight of single parenthood and medical bills and sleepless nights etched in the lines around his eyes. "Would you like some coffee?" Grace found herself asking. "There's a diner just off the bridge. My treat." Jake's pride bristled. "We don't need charity." "It's not charity," Grace said quietly. "It's gratitude. You saved my life, Jake Morrison. The least I can do is buy you breakfast." They ended up at Mel's 24-hour diner, a worn establishment that had survived gentrification through sheer stubbornness and excellent coffee. Mia fell asleep against Grace's shoulder while Jake counted quarters to pay for his coffee, a gesture that made Grace's throat tighten with emotion she didn't expect. As Jake spoke about insurance denials and treatment costs, Grace found herself calculating numbers in her head. The experimental drug Mia needed. She'd heard about it in medical journals, knew which company manufactured it, knew the astronomical cost that put it beyond most families' reach. Her phone buzzed insistently. William Sullivan's name flashed across the screen, and Grace felt the familiar weight of expectation and control settling back around her shoulders like a familiar coat she'd tried to shed. "I have to go," she said reluctantly, slipping a business card across the table. "G. Sullivan, private consultant," it read, with only a phone number below. Jake studied the card as she left, something nagging at him about the surname. Later that evening, after tucking Mia into bed, he would Google G. Sullivan and discover a truth that would change everything. 2 days after the bridge encounter, Jake Morrison's world tilted on its axis in the sterile corridors of Mount Sinai Hospital. Mia had woken up that morning with a fever that spiked to 103 degrees, her small body racked with chills that no blanket could warm. The emergency room became a blur of urgent voices and fluorescent lights as Jake watched his daughter's life hang in the balance of blood counts and oxygen levels. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a 67-year-old pediatric oncologist who had become both savior and messenger of hard truths, pulled Jake aside with the weight of decades in her voice. "Jake, we need to talk about Sully Cure X," she said, her weathered hands folding over a thick medical file. "It's our last conventional option." The drug's name hit Jake like ice water. Sullivan. The same surname from the business card that had led him down a rabbit hole of Google searches 2 nights prior. Sullivan Pharmaceuticals dominated the search results, along with images of charity galas and board meetings featuring a man named William Sullivan and his daughter, Grace. The treatment protocol cost $485,000, Dr. Hayes continued, her voice gentle but unflinching. "Insurance has issued their final denial. I'm sorry, Jake." Jake stared through the window of Mia's room, where his daughter lay connected to monitors that beeped with mechanical precision. The number, $485,000, might as well have been $10 million. His entire life's earnings wouldn't approach that figure, and the medical debt had already consumed his retirement savings, his home equity, everything he'd built during his years in banking. "There has to be another way," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. "Actually," came a familiar voice from behind them, "there might be." Jake turned to see Grace approaching in hospital scrubs, a volunteer badge clipped to her shirt pocket. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and without the designer dress and desperate expression from the bridge, she looked younger, more approachable. But the recognition in her eyes carried a weight that made Jake's stomach drop. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, his voice sharper than intended. "I've been volunteering here for 3 years," Grace said quietly. "Pediatric oncology. I heard about Mia's admission." Dr. Hayes looked between them with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed countless family dramas play out in hospital hallways. "You two know each other?" "We met recently," Grace said, her gaze never leaving Jake's face. "Jake, I need to tell you something about who I am." The conversation that followed unfolded like a slow-motion collision. Grace led them to a private consultation room where she revealed the truth that Jake had already begun to suspect but hadn't wanted to believe. She wasn't just connected to Sullivan Pharmaceuticals. She was the heir to the entire empire, the daughter of the man whose company manufactured the drug that could save Mia's life. "William Sullivan is my father," she said, the words hanging in the air like a confession. "And I've been trying to find a way to help Mia since the moment I met her." Jake's world reframed itself around this revelation. The woman he'd saved from suicide was a billionaire's daughter. The grateful stranger who'd bought him coffee was someone who could write a check for Mia's treatment without missing a mortgage payment. The connection he'd felt on the bridge. Was any of it real, or had he been part of some elaborate performance? So this is what rich people do for entertainment? Jake's voice cut through the sterile air like a blade. Play games with dying children? Was the bridge just theater? Grace's face went pale. Jake, no. It's not like that. Then what is it like? He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against linoleum. You've been watching my daughter suffer, knowing you could help, knowing your family's company is the reason we can't afford treatment. What kind of person does that make you? The kind who wanted to be a doctor, Grace said, her voice breaking. The kind who's been secretly funding patient assistance programs for families like yours. The kind whose father threatened to disown her if she pursued medicine instead of business. Dr. Hayes cleared her throat diplomatically. Grace has indeed been instrumental in securing treatment for several of our families. Her unofficial consultations have saved lives. Jake stared at Grace, trying to reconcile the desperate woman from the bridge with this revelation of wealth and power. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you'd react exactly like this, Grace said. I knew you'd see the money first and stop seeing me as a person, just like everyone else does. The silence stretched between them, filled with the distant sounds of hospital life. Announcements over intercoms, the squeak of gurneys, the soft conversations of families facing impossible choices. Through the window, Jake could see Mia sleeping, her small form dwarfed by medical equipment that cost more per day than he earned in a month. I want to pay for her treatment, Grace said finally. All of it. No strings attached, no publicity, no tax write-offs. Just because she deserves to live. Jake's pride warred with his desperation, a battle that played out across his features like storm clouds. I won't be your charity case, he said, but the conviction in his voice wavered. Pride doesn't cure cancer, Grace replied, echoing the harsh wisdom that Dr. Hayes had shared with countless families over the years. As Grace left the hospital that afternoon, she left behind more than just an offer of financial help. She left behind the beginning of a truth that would reshape everything Jake thought he knew about wealth, sacrifice, and the complex mathematics of love. That evening, an anonymous tip would reach his phone, containing information that would reveal just how many families Grace had been quietly helping, and how long she'd been defying her father to do it. The week following Grace's revelation transformed into a chess game, played with human lives as pieces. William Sullivan's private investigator delivered his report on a Thursday morning, the manila folder landing on the mahogany desk like a death sentence. Inside, Jake Morrison's financial ruin was documented with clinical precision. The foreclosure notices, the maxed-out credit cards, the desperate loan applications that had been rejected by every bank in Manhattan. Classic fortune hunter, the investigator concluded, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd seen this pattern countless times. Single father, desperate circumstances, targets the vulnerable heiress. It's textbook manipulation. William Sullivan studied the photographs of Jake leaving Mount Sinai at dawn, his security uniform wrinkled from a long night shift, his face etched with exhaustion. This was the man his daughter had chosen over Derek Whitfield, heir to a media empire and the key to a merger that would expand Sullivan Pharmaceuticals into European markets. The logic escaped him entirely. The confrontation in the Sullivan penthouse that evening could be heard 3 floors down. Grace stood in the marble foyer where she'd taken her first steps as a child, now facing the man who'd shaped every aspect of her existence through control disguised as love. You will end this fantasy immediately, William declared, his voice echoing off the walls lined with awards and accolades. I've tolerated your volunteer work, your little medical hobby, but I will not watch you destroy everything I've built for some desperate man who sees dollar signs when he looks at you." "He doesn't even know about my trust fund," Grace shot back, her voice carrying 3 decades of suppressed rebellion. "He's too proud to accept help paying for coffee, let alone medical treatment. Pride is a luxury he can't afford with a dying child," William replied coldly. "Men like him will say anything, do anything when their children's lives are at stake. He saved you on that bridge because he calculated the odds of reward." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Grace felt something crystallize in her chest, a clarity that had been building since she'd met Jake and Mia. "You don't know him at all." "I know his type," William continued, pulling out his phone. "I'm offering him $2 million to disappear from your life. I guarantee he'll take it." But Jake Morrison surprised them both. When William's lawyer called that evening with the offer, Jake's response was immediate and unambiguous. "My daughter's life isn't for sale, and neither is my integrity. Tell Mr. Sullivan to go to hell." William's retaliation was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours, Jake found himself unemployed. The security company received a call from Sullivan Pharmaceuticals' legal department, expressing concerns about an employee who'd been displaying unstable behavior around hospital patients. The message was clear: Jake Morrison was a liability they couldn't afford. The ripple effects cascaded through Jake's life like falling dominoes. Without steady income, the eviction notice arrived within a week. Mia's treatment had to be postponed when Jake couldn't afford the gas money to drive to the hospital for her appointments. Frank Morrison, Jake's father, offered his life savings, $18,000 scraped together from VA benefits and Social Security, but it was a drop in an ocean of need. "Take the rich man's money, son," Frank urged during one of their late-night conversations in the hospital waiting room. "Your pride ain't worth more than Mia's life." "It's not about pride, Dad," Jake replied, watching his daughter sleep through the window. "It's about what kind of man I am. If I take his money to disappear from Grace's life, what does that make me?" "A father who puts his child first," Frank answered without hesitation. "I've seen good men make hard choices in war, Jake. Sometimes survival means swallowing your principles." Meanwhile, Grace was fighting her own battle on multiple fronts. She'd liquidated her personal trust fund, $3.2 million accumulated from birthday gifts and investment dividends, and attempted to anonymously pay Mia's medical bills. The hospital's financial department informed her that the Morrison account was already current, paid in full by a mysterious benefactor. The discovery that her father had been manipulating the situation from the beginning sent Grace into a rage that surprised even William. She confronted him in his office at Sullivan Pharmaceuticals, her voice carrying across the 52nd floor like a hurricane wind. "You're using a dying child as leverage against me," she accused, slamming the door behind her hard enough to rattle the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. "I'm protecting you from making the biggest mistake of your life," William replied calmly, not looking up from his computer screen. "That man would say anything to secure his daughter's future, including telling you he loves you." "He's never said he loves me," Grace said quietly, and the admission cut deeper than she'd expected. In all their conversations, through all the connection she'd felt, Jake had never spoken of love. Neither had she, for that matter. But the absence of those words suddenly felt significant. "Because he's smart," William continued. "He knows you're vulnerable, looking for meaning after your mother's death. He's playing a long game, Grace. And you're losing." Grace stared at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her adult life. "You did this to Mom too, didn't you? When she wanted to treat charity cases, when she wanted to work in free clinics, you stopped her the same way." William's fingers froze over the keyboard. Margaret Sullivan had been dead for 12 years, but her ghost still haunted every decision he made. Your mother was idealistic to a fault. She would have bankrupted us trying to save the world. She would have saved lives, Grace corrected. And maybe if you'd let her follow her calling, she wouldn't have fallen into the depression that killed her. The accusation struck home with surgical precision. William's careful composure cracked, revealing the grief and guilt he'd carried for over a decade. Margaret's suicide, for that's what it had been, though the family had called it an accidental overdose, had been preceded by months of arguing about her desire to volunteer at inner-city clinics, her need to use her medical degree for something more meaningful than treating wealthy patients' cosmetic concerns. "Your mother chose to leave us," William said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She chose to escape the cage you built around her," Grace replied. "The same cage you're building around me." That evening, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She walked into the clinical trial coordinator's office at Mount Sinai and added Mia Morrison to the experimental drug program, using her position as an unofficial consultant and her knowledge of the hospital's systems. She signed documents that legally bound her to stay away from Jake and Mia for the duration of the trial, a restraining order disguised as medical protocol. Jake received the news with suspicious gratitude. Mia had been accepted into the clinical trial for a new leukemia treatment, all costs covered by an anonymous research grant. He asked about the donor, but hospital administrators cited confidentiality agreements and legal protocols. Something about the timing felt orchestrated, but with his daughter's life in the balance, Jake couldn't afford to ask too many questions. What he didn't know was that Grace was watching from behind observation windows, monitoring every aspect of Mia's treatment while legally prohibited from direct contact. Dr. Hayes had become an unwitting accomplice, passing messages and updates between the separated pair, while Grace used her medical knowledge to guide treatment decisions from the shadows. The arrangement satisfied no one. Jake felt like a puppet dancing to invisible strings. His daughter's recovery depended on systems he didn't understand and couldn't control. Grace lived in limbo, close enough to help but forbidden from the human connection that had given her life meaning for the first time in years. William watched it all with the satisfaction of a general who'd successfully divided enemy forces, not realizing that his victory was hollow and his own family was the casualty. As Mia's treatment began and her small body started the fight against cancer with experimental drugs flowing through IV lines, the three adults who loved her most found themselves trapped in a triangle of legal restrictions, financial manipulation, and emotional warfare. The bridge where Jake and Grace had first met seemed like a metaphor for where they all stood now, suspended over dangerous waters, holding on by threads that could snap at any moment. The experimental drug coursed through Mia Morrison's tiny veins like liquid hope, each infusion monitored by machines that beeped with mechanical precision. Jake sat beside her hospital bed, reading Charlotte's Web for the third time that week, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Behind the observation window, Grace Sullivan watched through one-way glass, her medical knowledge allowing her to interpret the readouts that spelled out his daughter's chances of survival. 48 hours into the clinical trial, Mia's body began to rebel against the treatment. The experimental drug, designed to target aggressive leukemia cells, triggered a cascade reaction that sent alarms screaming through the pediatric ICU. Jake watched in horror as his daughter's small frame convulsed, her oxygen levels dropping as medical staff flooded the room with urgent efficiency. "Code Blue, Pediatric ICU, Room 347, the intercom announced with clinical detachment, but Grace heard it as a death knell. She burst through the legally mandated barriers, her restraining order forgotten in the face of emergency. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she helped stabilize Mia's airway, her medical training from Harvard finally put to the use she'd always intended. "Grace, you can't be here," Dr. Hayes warned, even as she accepted Grace's assistance with grateful relief. "The legal ramifications..." "Let them arrest me later," Grace replied, adjusting Mia's IV drip with the confidence of someone who'd spent countless hours studying pediatric oncology protocols. Right now, she needs all the help she can get. Jake stared at Grace's hands as they moved with surgical precision, seeing clearly for the first time that this wasn't charity or guilt driving her actions. This was competence born of genuine medical knowledge and years of secret practice. "You really are a doctor," he said softly, wonder replacing suspicion in his voice. "I never stopped being one," Grace replied, monitoring Mia's vital signs. "I just had to practice in secret." The crisis stabilized after 37 agonizing minutes. Mia's breathing regulated, her heart rate settled into normal rhythms, and the immediate danger passed like a storm moving out to sea. But the legal consequences of Grace's intervention were swift and unforgiving. Hospital security arrived within minutes, followed by William Sullivan's personal attorney, armed with restraining order documentation and threats of criminal prosecution. "You violated a legally binding agreement," the lawyer announced to the crowded room. "Mr. Sullivan is prepared to press charges for stalking, harassment, and violation of a restraining order." "She saved my daughter's life," Jake said, stepping between Grace and the security guards. "If that's a crime, then arrest me too, Doctor." Hayes intervened with the authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades navigating hospital politics and family crises. Grace Sullivan provided emergency medical assistance that prevented a fatality. Any legal action against her would create liability issues for the hospital that I'm certain Mr. Sullivan's board of directors would find problematic. The standoff in Mia's hospital room crystallized everything that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. Frank Morrison arrived during the commotion, having been called by a nurse who recognized the gravity of the situation. The Vietnam veteran took one look at the assembled lawyers and security guards surrounding his unconscious granddaughter and made a decision that would reshape the entire conflict. "I'm calling Channel 7, Frank announced, pulling out his cell phone. "Let's see how Mr. Sullivan's stock price handles the story about him prosecuting the woman who saved a little girl's life." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. William Sullivan's empire had been built on public trust in pharmaceutical companies, a trust that could evaporate overnight if the wrong story gained traction. The image of his daughter in handcuffs for saving a child's life would be exactly the kind of narrative that destroyed corporate reputations and triggered congressional investigations. Grace spent that night in a holding cell at the 19th Precinct, charged with violating a restraining order. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd once stood on a bridge ready to end her life, and now she faced imprisonment for saving one. Jake wanted to visit her, but the same legal restrictions that had separated them before now made any contact impossible. Instead, it was Frank Morrison who sat across from Grace in the sterile visitation room, his weathered hands folded on the metal table between them. "I fought in Vietnam," he said without preamble. "Saw good people make impossible choices every day. What you did today, that wasn't about money or family drama or any of this legal nonsense. That was about saving a life when you had the power to do it." "I couldn't just stand there and watch her die," Grace replied, her voice hoarse from crying. "Not when I knew how to help." "Your father thinks Jake's using you," Frank continued, "but I've watched that boy sacrifice everything for his daughter. Pride, career, financial security, he's given it all up for her. A man like that doesn't need to manipulate anyone. He just needs people to see what's right in front of them." The conversation lasted 30 minutes, but it planted seeds that would grow into something larger than either of them anticipated. Frank left the jail and drove straight to Sullivan Pharmaceuticals headquarters, requesting a meeting with William Sullivan. The billionaire, curious about this direct approach from Jake Morrison's father, agreed to see him. Their conversation in William's office was a collision between two different worlds, one built on power and control, the other on service and sacrifice. Frank Morrison sat in a leather chair that cost more than his monthly Social Security check and looked William Sullivan in the eye with the directness of someone who'd faced enemy fire and survived. "Your daughter is exactly like her mother," Frank said, studying the family photographs that lined William's desk. "Both of them doctors who wanted to heal people instead of profit from their suffering." "Grace needs protection from people who would exploit her compassion," William replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "She needs freedom to be the doctor she always wanted to be," Frank countered. "And my son needs someone who understands that love isn't about what you can give or take. It's about standing together when everything falls apart." As Frank spoke, William found himself remembering Margaret's final months, when she'd begged him to let her work in free clinics, to use her medical degree for something more meaningful than treating wealthy patients' minor ailments. He'd refused, citing security concerns and social obligations, never recognizing that he was slowly suffocating the very thing that made her extraordinary. "I've made mistakes," William admitted quietly, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "But I won't watch my daughter destroy her future for a fantasy." "With respect, Mr. Sullivan," Frank replied, "the only person destroying Grace's future is sitting behind that desk." The meeting ended without resolution, but something had shifted in William's understanding of the situation. That evening he would drive to Mount Sinai Hospital and see his daughter through the observation window of Mia's room, watching her monitor the child's vital signs with the focused intensity of someone born to heal. For the first time in years, he would see Grace not as his heir or his responsibility, but as the doctor Margaret had always wanted to become. The legal machinery of William Sullivan's empire ground forward with merciless efficiency, crushing everything in its path like an avalanche of litigation and corporate power. Grace Sullivan spent 3 days in custody while her father's legal team prepared a case that would permanently separate her from Jake Morrison and his daughter. The charges expanded beyond simple restraining order violation to include stalking, criminal harassment, and interference with medical procedures, each count carrying potential jail time that would effectively end her medical aspirations forever. Jake Morrison watched his world disintegrate from the uncomfortable chair beside Mia's hospital bed. The experimental drug treatment had been suspended pending administrative review, a euphemism that everyone understood meant William Sullivan was withdrawing his cooperation from the clinical trial. Without access to the medication, Mia's condition began a terrifying decline that played out in blood counts and oxygen saturation levels that dropped like autumn leaves. Dr. Eleanor Hayes delivered the prognosis with the gentle brutality that came from 40 years of pediatric oncology practice. "Without continued treatment, we're looking at weeks, maybe a month," she said, her weathered hands folding over Mia's chart. "I'm sorry, Jake. I've exhausted every option available to us." The Sullivan Pharmaceuticals Board of Directors gathered in emergency session as news of the legal battle began leaking to financial media outlets. Stock prices fluctuated wildly as investors tried to interpret the implications of the CEO's family drama. The headline, "Pharmaceutical Heiress Jailed for Treating Sick Child," dominated business news cycles, creating exactly the kind of publicity nightmare that could trigger congressional investigations into drug pricing and corporate ethics. Margaret Chen, the board's senior independent director, addressed William directly during the closed-door session. "This personal vendetta is becoming a fiduciary liability," she stated with characteristic bluntness. "Our shareholders didn't invest in family therapy sessions. Either resolve this situation professionally, or the board will consider alternative leadership structures." The threat of corporate coup hung in the conference room air like ozone before a thunderstorm. William had built Sullivan Pharmaceuticals from a small research lab into a global empire. But boards of directors had their own logic that transcended personal loyalty or family bonds. If his conflict with Grace threatened quarterly earnings or regulatory scrutiny, they would remove him with the same efficiency they used to eliminate underperforming drug candidates. Public opinion began crystallizing around Grace's situation through social media campaigns that transformed her from pharmaceutical heiress into folk hero. The hashtag #SaveMia. And Grace trended nationally as thousands shared stories of their own struggles with medical costs and insurance denials. Pictures of 5-year-old Mia in her hospital bed, connected to monitors and IV lines, became symbols of everything wrong with American health care. Jake found himself at the center of a media storm he never wanted or understood. Television producers called constantly, offering six-figure sums for exclusive interviews about his relationship with Grace Sullivan and the corporate machinations threatening his daughter's life. He refused them all, maintaining a dignity that impressed even his critics, and further undermined William's narrative about fortune-hunting motivations. Frank Morrison became an unlikely media spokesperson for the family, his Vietnam veteran credentials and plain-spoken wisdom making him a compelling figure for news outlets seeking authentic voices in the manufactured drama. During a CNN interview that would be replayed thousands of times, he looked directly into the camera and delivered words that cut through corporate spin like a combat knife. "My granddaughter is dying while lawyers argue about restraining orders," Frank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed real combat. Grace Sullivan risked her freedom to save Mia's life, and now she's in jail while her father plays power games with a little girl's medicine. If that's what passes for family values among billionaires, then maybe they need to remember what family actually means. The interview went viral within hours, shared across platforms by parents who recognized their own fears in Frank's words. William Sullivan watched it from his penthouse office, seeing his public image crumble in real time as social media users transformed his protective father narrative into heartless corporate greed. The juxtaposition was devastating. A working-class veteran defending his dying granddaughter against a pharmaceutical billionaire who had jailed his own daughter for providing medical care. Inside her jail cell, Grace Sullivan experienced a different kind of awakening. Separated from the privileges and protections that had insulated her entire life, she found clarity that had eluded her in penthouses and boardrooms. Her cellmate, a nurse named Patricia, who'd been arrested for stealing medication to treat uninsured patients, became an unlikely mentor in the ethics of medical civil disobedience. Sometimes doing right means breaking rules made by people who never had to watch children die for lack of money, Patricia explained during one of their long conversations. Your medical oath says, first, do no harm, but sometimes not helping is the greatest harm of all. Grace began writing letters to medical journals, outlining her research into pediatric cancer treatments and detailing the administrative barriers that prevented breakthrough therapies from reaching the patients who needed them most. Her jailhouse writings, smuggled out by sympathetic guards and published online, revealed a depth of medical knowledge that surprised even her critics, and proved that her volunteer work had been substantive medical practice rather than wealthy dilettante charity. The letters also revealed the personal cost of her father's control, describing years of suppressed medical ambitions and the psychological toll of watching children die while possessing the knowledge and resources to help them. One passage, shared millions of times across social platforms, captured the essence of her transformation. I inherited billions of dollars but was bankrupt of purpose until I met a man who had nothing but gave everything for his daughter's chance at life. As Grace wrote from her cell and Mia's condition deteriorated in her hospital bed, William Sullivan faced the most difficult decision of his corporate career. The board's patience was exhausting. Public opinion had turned decisively against him, and his own daughter was becoming a symbol of medical ethics that threatened everything he'd built. The empire he'd created to honor his wife's memory was crumbling under the weight of choices that betrayed her values at every turn. The tragedy was reaching its crescendo, but none of the participants yet understood that the darkest moment would reveal truths that would reshape not just their family, but the entire pharmaceutical industry's approach to pediatric cancer treatment. The revelation began with a manila folder forgotten in Margaret Sullivan's personal effects, discovered by chance when William finally brought himself to clean out her private study 12 years after her death. Inside, beneath layers of medical journals and research notes, lay her personal diary from the months before her suicide, pages filled with elegant handwriting that would shatter everything William believed about his wife's death and his daughter's rebellion. October 15th, one entry read in Margaret's distinctive script. William forbade me from volunteering at the children's clinic again today. He says it's beneath our social standing to treat charity cases, that it reflects poorly on Sullivan Pharmaceuticals' image. But these children are dying and I have the knowledge to help them. How can love mean asking someone to ignore suffering? William's hands trembled as he read entry after entry, documenting his wife's growing desperation to use her medical degree meaningfully. The pattern was sickeningly familiar. Margaret's desire to treat underprivileged patients, his insistence that she focus on their wealthy social circle, her gradual withdrawal into depression as she felt increasingly trapped by expectations and obligations. December 3rd, I watched a 6-year-old girl die today because her family couldn't afford the medication that Williams' company manufactures. The irony is suffocating. We profit from healing while denying healing to those who need it most. I'm becoming complicit in a system that values shareholder returns over human lives. The final entries were the most devastating, revealing Margaret's growing identification with the patients she couldn't save and her increasing sense of moral complicity in their deaths. I married a man who builds empires on other people's suffering, she wrote just days before her overdose. And I've been his willing accomplice, silent while children die preventable deaths. Grace must never become what I've become, a bystander to tragedy with the power to intervene. William staggered to his bar cart, pouring 3 fingers of scotch with hands that shook like earthquake aftershocks. The whiskey burned, but not as much as the realization that he'd killed his wife as surely as if he'd administered the fatal dose of sleeping pills himself. Margaret hadn't died from depression. She'd died from moral suffocation, from being forced to choose between her husband's approval and her medical conscience. The parallel to Grace's situation struck him like physical violence. His daughter's secret volunteer work, her medical expertise, her willingness to risk everything to save Mia Morrison, it was Margaret's dream finally finding expression through their child. And he'd been systematically destroying it, just as he'd destroyed Margaret's calling 25 years earlier. His phone buzzed with an urgent message from his head of security. Sullivan Pharmaceuticals headquarters surrounded by protesters, estimate 2,000+ people, media coverage extensive, board members requesting immediate executive meeting. William looked out his penthouse windows to see the crowd 52 floors below. A sea of protesters holding signs reading, "Free Grace Sullivan" and "Healthcare is a human right." Television news helicopters circled the building like mechanical vultures, broadcasting live coverage of the largest pharmaceutical protest in Manhattan's history. Dr. Hayes appeared at Sullivan Pharmaceuticals' executive offices unannounced that afternoon, her hospital credentials gaining her access through security checkpoints designed to keep protesters at bay. She carried with her a leather portfolio containing Grace's complete medical research from the past 3 years, documentation that would prove Grace Sullivan wasn't just a volunteer playing doctor, but a legitimate medical researcher whose work had advanced pediatric cancer treatment in ways the medical establishment had failed to recognize. Your daughter has developed treatment protocols that have saved 37 children's lives, Dr. Hayes announced to the emergency board meeting, spreading Grace's research across the mahogany conference table. Her modifications to existing chemotherapy regimens have increased survival rates by 18% in our pediatric ward. She's not a dilettante. She's a medical innovator whose work belongs in peer-reviewed journals. The board members studied Grace's research with growing amazement. Her mathematical models for drug dosage optimization, her protocols for minimizing treatment side effects, her comprehensive studies of socioeconomic factors in pediatric cancer outcomes. The work represented years of sophisticated medical research that rivaled anything produced by Sullivan Pharmaceuticals' own research division. Margaret Chen, the board's senior director, addressed William directly. Your daughter has been conducting advanced medical research under our company's nose while we've been focused on profit margins and market share. This is exactly the kind of innovation that could transform our public image and our actual mission. But the most devastating revelation came from Detective Ray O'Connor, who had been quietly investigating the circumstances surrounding Grace's bridge suicide attempt. His findings, delivered in a private meeting with William, revealed connections that transformed every assumption about the morning Jake Morrison saved Grace's life. Your daughter wasn't on that bridge because of depression or family pressure, Detective O'Connor explained, consulting his notes with professional precision. She was there because she'd just learned that Mia Morrison had been denied access to your company's experimental drug trial. Grace had been secretly advocating for the child's inclusion for weeks. The detective's investigation had uncovered Grace's extensive communications with Dr. Hayes and other medical professionals, her personal funding of patient advocacy programs, and her increasingly desperate attempts to circumvent her father's pharmaceutical company's restrictive patient selection criteria. Grace's suicide attempt hadn't been about arranged marriages or corporate pressure. It had been about feeling powerless to save a dying child despite having the medical knowledge and family connections to make treatment possible. She felt responsible for Mia Morrison's situation because she couldn't convince your company's selection committee to include the child in clinical trials, Detective O'Connor continued. In her mind, her family's company was condemning a 5-year-old to death while she stood by helplessly. William stared out his office windows at the protesters below, finally understanding that his daughter's actions had never been about rebellion against his authority. They'd been about living up to the medical principles her mother had died trying to uphold. Grace hadn't been betraying the Sullivan family legacy. She'd been fulfilling it in ways he'd been too blind to recognize. The phone call to the district attorney came that evening, William's voice steady despite the emotional earthquake reshaping his understanding of everything he'd built and everyone he'd lost. "I'm dropping all charges against my daughter immediately," he announced. Grace Sullivan committed no crime except trying to save a child's life while I was too stubborn to see the truth. The call to Jake Morrison was harder, requiring him to admit mistakes that went beyond legal maneuvering into fundamental failures of character and judgment. "Mr. Morrison," William said, his voice carrying decades of accumulated regret. "I've been wrong about everything. About you, about Grace, about what it means to honor my wife's memory. If you'll allow it, I'd like to discuss how we can save your daughter, and maybe begin to save ourselves." As Grace Sullivan walked out of jail that night, free for the first time in her adult life to practice medicine according to her conscience, she didn't yet know that her father had spent the day discovering truths that would transform not just their relationship, but the entire pharmaceutical industry's approach to treating children who couldn't afford to live. 6 months later, the Brooklyn Bridge stood transformed in the golden light of a March morning, its steel cables strung with fairy lights that caught the sunrise like captured stars. The same spot where Grace Sullivan had once stood ready to end her life now hosted a celebration of beginnings, as families affected by pediatric cancer gathered to witness something extraordinary. not just a wedding, but the birth of a movement that would reshape American healthcare. Mia Morrison ran across the bridge's walkway with the boundless energy of a healthy 6-year-old, her remission complete and her future stretching ahead like the suspension cables overhead. Her flower girl dress sparkled with sequins that matched the joy in her eyes as she scattered rose petals along the path where her father would soon marry the woman who had saved both their lives in ways neither had initially understood. Grace Sullivan walked down the aisle wearing her mother's simple white dress, altered to fit her smaller frame but carrying the same elegance that had captivated William Sullivan 30 years earlier. Her medical degree from Harvard hung framed in their new apartment, but more importantly, her work at the newly established Margaret Sullivan Pediatric Research Institute had already begun saving lives on a scale that exceeded her most ambitious dreams. Jake Morrison stood at the improvised altar, wearing his grandfather's navy dress uniform that Frank had pressed and altered for the occasion. The transformation in his appearance went beyond the formal clothing. Months of partnership with Grace and reconciliation with William had erased the desperate edge that had defined him during Mia's illness. He was still the devoted father who had risked everything for his daughter, but now he was also a man who had found love in the most impossible circumstances and helped create something larger than himself. William Sullivan served as officiant, having obtained his ordination through an online ministry in a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. His voice carried across the bridge as he spoke words that had been crafted through months of family therapy and personal reflection. We gather here where lives almost ended to celebrate where new life begins. Jake and Grace have taught us that love isn't about controlling those we care about. It's about empowering them to become their truest selves. The ceremony drew guests from every corner of their transformed lives. Dr. Eleanor Hayes stood as Grace's matron of honor, her weathered hands steady as she held the rings that symbolized commitment forged through crisis. Frank Morrison walked Grace down the aisle with the pride of a man who had lived long enough to see justice triumph over power, his purple heart pinned to his veteran's lapel catching the morning light. But the most meaningful guests were the families who had been touched by the new Sullivan Pharmaceuticals Patient Assistance Program, launched 6 months earlier with Grace as its director. Parents held children who might not have survived under the old system, living testimonies to what happened when medical ethics triumphed over profit margins. The vows they exchanged were written together during their Tuesday evening conversations in Central Park, refined through the kind of deep communication that comes only from surviving trauma together. Grace's voice carried across the bridge as she spoke. "Jake, you saved my life before I ever met you by showing me that heroism doesn't require wealth or status, it just requires the courage to do what's right when everything is at stake." Jake's response brought tears to eyes throughout the assembled crowd. "Grace, you taught me that accepting help isn't weakness when it means our daughter gets to grow up. You showed me that love multiplies when we share it instead of guarding it, and that sometimes the person who needs saving is the one doing the rescuing." The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed not just by their guests, but by live television coverage that reached millions of viewers who had followed their story through social media and news reports. The image of their embrace, with Mia jumping between them and the Brooklyn Bridge rising behind them, became an iconic photograph that would hang in pediatric hospitals across the country. The reception took place at the new Second Chances Cafe, opened 3 blocks from the bridge in a renovated warehouse that had been transformed into a community gathering space. The cafe's mission extended beyond serving coffee. It housed support groups for families facing medical crises, job training programs for people rebuilding their lives, and art therapy sessions for children dealing with serious illnesses. Mia Morrison Sullivan, officially adopted by Grace during a courthouse ceremony that had required no legal maneuvering because love made the paperwork irrelevant, performed her first piano recital that afternoon. Her rendition of Amazing Grace filled the cafe while adults who had forgotten how to hope found themselves believing in second chances again. William Sullivan's speech to the reception guests marked his public transformation from pharmaceutical baron to advocate for affordable health care. "I spent 25 years building a company that made me wealthy while families like Jake's went bankrupt, trying to save their children," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "My daughter and my new son-in-law taught me that real success isn't measured in stock prices. It's measured in lives saved and families kept together." The Margaret and Grace Sullivan Foundation, endowed with half of William's personal fortune, had already begun funding pediatric cancer research at hospitals nationwide. But more importantly, it had lobbied successfully for legislation requiring pharmaceutical companies to provide free medication to families below certain income thresholds, transforming an industry that had operated on pure profit motive for decades. As evening fell over New York City, the new family stood together on the Brooklyn Bridge, watching the lights come alive across Manhattan's skyline. Mia slept peacefully in Jake's arms, her face serene with the security of a child who had never doubted she was loved completely and unconditionally. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that morning?" Grace asked, her head resting against Jake's shoulder as they watched boats move through the harbor below. "Every day," Jake replied quietly. "But then I remember that some things are meant to be. You were meant to live. Mia was meant to survive, and we were meant to find each other exactly when we needed each other most." The bridge stretched between two shores, just as their love had bridged the gap between two worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart. Behind them, the Second Chances Cafe glowed with warm light, welcoming anyone who needed to believe that tomorrow could be different from today. Ahead of them lay a future built not on wealth or status, but on the simple revolutionary idea that every life has infinite value and every family deserves hope. Dear friends, Jake and Grace's story reminds us that it's never too late to rewrite our legacy. Like William Sullivan, many of us have spent decades building walls to protect those we love, only to discover we've been imprisoning them instead. We've prioritized security over dreams, control over connection, thinking that our experience gives us the right to dictate our children's choices. But true wisdom lies in recognizing when our protective instincts have become barriers to the very happiness we sought to preserve. Frank Morrison, a Vietnam veteran, understood something profound. Real strength isn't about having all the answers. It's about admitting when we're wrong and finding the courage to change. At 71, he became the bridge that reconnected a fractured family, proving that our most important victories often come not from standing our ground, but from learning when to lay down our armor. Whether you're a grandparent watching your adult children struggle, or someone who spent years building something you thought mattered only to question its true value, remember that redemption stories don't have age limits. The Brooklyn Bridge still stands today, connecting not just two boroughs but two possibilities: the life we've lived and the life we can still choose to live. Share your thoughts. What walls have you built in the name of love that might actually be keeping love out? Have you ever had to choose between being right and being connected?